Dramatica uses the word appreciation in place of story point, usually. Why? Because appreciation requires involving the audience. A story point only requires involving the author. If the author says, this is what I want to talk about, that's a story point. If the author also says, I want to position the audience here in relationship to that topic, to that subject I want to talk about, that now is an appreciation because it creates a perspective between the point of view and what's being looked at. That perspective is where the meaning is held. You understand a definition of what's being talked about by the author through the choice of the story point, but only by creating an appreciation of that story point do you imbue that topic with meaning for the audience. So what are some of these appreciations that we find in Dramatica that are most specific to plot? Well, in fact, there's two kinds again. Now, before we describe the two kinds of plot appreciations, or story points if you're more the traditionalist, look at what we've already done in plot. We've said plot isn't just the order of events that occur in a story, it's the internal logic of the story, and only when you take the internal logic and then determine how you're going to unfold that through exposition do you create that final order of events in a story. So if you wanted to create a plot, you don't want to just say, then I'm going to tell the audience this, and then I'm going to write about this, and then this is next. If you 3x5 card it, and that's all you're doing is determining how you're going to tell the audience about things, you may be leaving out big chunks of what actually happens in the story that will appear later as wholes. Or you may make connections that are untrue, or warped as it were. It's important to work out on 3x5 cards the order in which events happen inside your story, and then if you want to reveal them in a different order, mix up the cards to show how that order is going to be for the audience. But do the plotting first, the structural part first, or you may have holes in your story later. That's the first thing Dramatica does. The second thing was to say that plot affects character and theme and genre as well. So if you divided cards into, this is the development of my genre, this is the development of my theme, this is the development of my character, and here are the events that occur in plot, you'll need to put them side by side as if they were 4 through lines in your story to make sure that everything that happens in one is compatible with what's going on in the others, and that they're properly matched or properly staggered so that if something needs to happen in plot first to drive a character decision later, they occur in that proper order. Already, Dramatica is getting very, very specific, which is what Dramatica tries to do, rather than lumping things into nebulous terms. But now we have two kinds of plot events, even if you just take plot by itself. And they are the static plot appreciations and the progressive plot appreciations. Static plot appreciations are things that don't change over the course of the story. They are concepts that are always in the background, like the story's goal. If you strip away the exposition part, the story weaving part, where you might fool the audience by making them think the goal is one thing and it later turns out to be something else, or keep them in the dark by only giving them certain indications of what the plot might be and then filling in a little bit more until finally towards the end of the story they figure out what the goal really is. Still in all, when everything is said and done, the audience can look back at the story just as the author constructed it and say, this is what the goal really was. Well, when all is said and done and all the smoke clears, what is the goal of the story? It always was the goal of the story. It's a static plot appreciation. So are the requirements for the goal. They can't change. It might turn out that they're only revealed over time, but this goal has these particular requirements. If the goal is not met, another story point is the consequence. What consequence will occur if the goal is not achieved? These are consistent, and several others, throughout the course of the story. And because they don't change, because they're always the focus of the efforts in the story, they are static, the static plot appreciations. Then the second kind are progressive plot appreciations, like acts, scenes, sequences, events, the order of particular events. These are things that change their focus from one focus to another over time. The nature, the feel, the topics described in or the activities engaged in a particular act will have an overall identity to them. And you feel that identity shift when a complete exploration has been made at one point and we move on to the next act. The next act basically says the story mind has fully explored all of the issues and engaged in all these methodologies of problem solving represented by the plot. And now that it's done that for one particular aspect of the overall story's problem, it's time to shift to another way of examining these things, because a solution was not found here. And so each time we have that major kind of a shift, we feel an act break. And in fact, we feel that act break for each of the 4 through lines of the story, the 4 essential through lines: main character, obstacle character, subject of story, and object of story. Main character represents the audience position in the story, so they represent I, me. The obstacle character represents an alternative outlook that the main character might adopt. That's you. I look at you and your alternative and determine as a main character whether or not to accept your outlook. The subjective story is we, the relationship between the main character and the obstacle, between me and you, as the two of us tout our particular outlook and see if we can convince the other one to adopt our way of looking at things. And finally, the last perspective, the objective story, is they. They, in looking at all the characters in the story, not just the man and the obstacle, by function, and saying what do they actually do in the story. Not just in the plot, but in the theme and everything else. That's the objective story. However, each of these will have its own plot progression. Each of these will have its own series of acts that illustrate the main character's growth, the obstacle character's growing impact, the growing relationship or progression of the relationship between the main and the obstacle, and finally, the overall mechanism of the story and the objective story will have its own series of acts, and sequences, and scenes, and events within those scenes. And all of this contributes to the structural nature of the plot in the progressive plot appreciations. Now, plot, part 1, tonight, focuses only on the static plot appreciations. And part 2 next week, as again you might expect, we'll get into the progressive plot appreciations. So tonight, we'll tell you how to develop the singular items that are the focus of what goes on throughout the plot, the linchpins, the rallying points, the hinge points of all the events that will occur in your plot. And next week, we'll show you how to order those events for each of the 4 through lines.